My joy to come to you this Saturday, September the 3rd. Today's devotional is titled, it's a long one, The Gifts of the Rich Paled in Comparison to the Widow's Offering. Now our scripture reading, Mark chapter 12, Matthew chapter 23. There is a longer written introduction to this devotional today. You can find that at heartofashepherd.com. But for now, I'm going to dive into our story for today. This devotional, focusing on Mark chapter 12, is widely known as the widow's mite. I would prefer to say a portrait of consecration. Now remember, as we're studying Mark 12, that we are in the midst of Christ's final week before the cross. Might be a Wednesday, might be a Thursday, and of course the cross on this Friday. Well, we come to Mark chapter 12 and a portrait of giving. Now Mark wrote, Jesus sat over against the treasury, and he beheld how the people cast money into the treasury, and many that were rich cast in much. Mark 12, verse 41. Well, the treasury of the temple is believed to have been located in a large room known as the, quote, court of the women. Now, this was an area of the temple in which the women were allowed to enter. Well, Jesus sat, and as he did so, he observed the rich bringing their offerings and really making a great fanfare of the size or amount of the gifts, as you would see recorded in Matthew chapter 6. Well, as the Lord looked on, a poor widow came to the temple to worship God with her offering that was no more than, we read, 2 mites, which make a farthing. And that's found in verse 42 of Mark 12. Now here's a question. Who was this widow? And why did one who gave so little become an object for giving one's offering? Well, there are several items we might note concerning the widow. The first is found in verse 42 of Mark 12, and it's the obvious one. She was described as, and I quote, a poor widow. Vulnerable, perhaps childless, or at least without one who cared to accompany her to the temple. And surely lowly. Assuming the literal meaning of what it meant to be poor, she lived in an impoverished state. Perhaps with a haggard countenance and in tattered robes, she came to the temple to cast into the treasury 2 mites, the smallest of Jewish coins, which together was equal to a small brass coin known as a farthing. In other words, it was very little to give. And yet here's a closing thought for you. You might wonder regarding this poor widow, so what? Well, herein is a wonderful truth. The widow's offering was a great sacrifice in proportion to her means. And Christ looked upon her gift with admiration. That's important. I'm going to say it again. Her gift was great because it was weighed in proportion to her means. You see, she had given what she could not spare, while the rich gave out of their abundance in Mark 12, 43 through 44. And she cast in all that she had, even all her living, verse 44. In other words, she was giving up her right to use the 2 mites for her own needs and trusting God to provide. Now think about it. For all eternity, the poor widow commended in Mark chapter 12 is remembered, not for the size of her gift, but for her faith and sincere devotion. Here's a lesson for you. When we give as the Lord would have us give, God's heart is moved with compassion. You see, the question isn't how much you're giving. The question is how much are you giving in proportion to what you have. And may we be like the widow, giving in a great way. Maybe it's not the large amount we're able to give, but our devotion to God that draws His love, His admiration, and yes, His compassion. God bless you. Thank you for joining me for today's devotional.